So today what we do is basically what we call labor market sort of equilibrium, and in this one we will be discussing will be your 4 case market, which comes a lot in exams. So when you look at labor market sort of equilibrium, labor market equilibrium, we're looking at sort of 4 cases. The first case is case number 1 would be, which is what we call perfect competition in the labor market, where basically what happens is this, that both your employers and employees are sort of not that powerful in the labor market. They both are such that they get the wages from the market forces of demand supply, so they're not powerful at all in this case. And the second case, case number 2, is when you have one single employer who's powerful, and therefore what we say in this case, you have what we call a monopsony in the labor market. So case number 2 is monopsony, which means single employer in the labor market. And we'll see this, that in this case, because the employer is really powerful, he becomes what we call a wage setter rather than a wage taker. The third case would be what we call a bilateral monopoly. In this case, what we realize is that we have a monopsony, जो कि आपका single employer था, monopsony, versus we would have what we call a trade union. And this is where we'll see this, that the trade union is basically when all the employees come together, they become a single party and they start to negotiate with the employer. And because of this collective bargaining, we'll soon see that your equilibrium would be depending on the bargaining power of these parties. Whoever is more powerful will actually be having a say in terms of what wages to have. And the fourth case, case number 4, is basically when you have your trade union versus perfectly competitive sort of labor market. And this is where the employees are perfectly competitive, but trade union, the workers are acting like a single body, a single sort of unit, and they're trying to sort of negotiate for a higher sort of wage. So we'll have these 4 cases. The most sort of common sort of exam question that comes is basically how are wages determined in a perfectly competitive labor market? You know, like when you look at perfectly competitive labor market, just like any other perfect competition, there will be some assumptions, but then they ask you how are wages determined in that market. So when you look at this case, let's say this case number 1. Case number 1, which is perfect competition in the labor market. What we believe is this, that in this case, your wages are determined sort of through the market forces of demand and supply. So your market forces of demand and supply will determine what the wage rate would be in the market. But an important thing here to understand is that there are key assumptions that we need to mention before we talk about the equilibrium. The first key assumption that we want to mention in a labor market which is perfectly competitive is this, that there are large number of employers and employees and workers. So employers and workers. Okay, it's not like one firm which is employing other workers or one employee and all that. There are many workers being hired by many employers out there. So no one, we believe, has any market power whatsoever. And that's why the second assumption is this, that all firms and workers are wage takers. Being a wage taker, what happens is this, that there is no one having any economic power to affect wages. Whatever the wages are from the market forces of demand and supply, that will be the wage. There will be no one with the market power to determine the wages. Okay, that's a key assumption when it comes to perfect competitive labor market. The third assumption that we make is this, that labor is identical or homogeneous, which means that there is no power, no differences in terms of skills, no differences in terms of education, no sort of differences in terms of anything that can make the worker ask for a higher wage rate than another worker, right? And the fourth assumption that we have when it comes to labor market is that there is perfect knowledge. Perfect knowledge basically means that the employer and employees know about the working conditions. They exactly know what the working conditions are. They exactly know what wages are going out there in the market. They know exactly, so no one can fool you by saying that, like, I'm paying X salary while salary was something more or higher or different than other employees, right? So there is perfect knowledge as employers and employees are aware of the wages and conditions in the market. This is for the industry, yes. This is for our industry. So we believe one industry is perfectly competitive. So let's say market for schools is perfectly competitive. So employers, many employees, for example, right? So that's how we're assuming it. Just one particular industry is perfectly competitive. The last one which we have here is this that matter is this, that there is perfect occupational and geographical mobility. Just 1 minute. This occupational and geographical mobility means that you can easily go from one job to another without much, because there is a complete skill set, identical skill set, and also you can move from one area to another. No barriers of one sort or the other. Basically, the assumption in the labor market, which is basically saying this, that you have these assumptions in the labor market. Now, the next thing we want to look at basically is an important discussion, which is that how are then wages determined given these assumptions. So we believe we're going to make 3 diagrams here. We're going to make the diagram for the firm, for the market, and for the worker. Okay, this is basically when you look at your quantity, we're looking at quantity to be your labor hours. Okay, so labor hours is what we're looking at, quantity of workers. And this is wage rate per hour. We said this, the wages are determined through the market forces of demand and supply. Are you all with me? So the market forces of demand and supply will determine what the wage rate would be. So demand and supply would be determining what the wage rate would be. And that would mean my wage rate would be, for example, WC. And the quantity of hours would be, let's call this QC. Okay, market में demand supply जहाँ पे होगा वहाँ पे we determine what the wage rate would be in the market. Now this wage rate is then taken by the firm, and the firm will be saying that, okay, given let's say this is $20 per hour, this is $20 per hour is the cost of hiring workers. I can hire 1 worker, 2 workers, 3 workers, any amount of workers, but I got to pay every worker that I hire for would be $15-20 per hour. So for him, this wage rate is what we call the marginal cost of hiring a worker. So this is your supply of labor, which is also your marginal cost. So your marginal cost of hiring worker would be this much. Since I have little space, I'm going to write this here. Supply of labor is your marginal cost of hiring the worker, which is basically saying this, that you can hire as many workers as possible at the going wage rate. So this will be your W, let's call this C, the wage rate, but you have a perfectly elastic supply of labor. Perfectly elastic means that you are a wage taker. Make sense? No matter how many workers you hire, you got to pay them the going wage rate. But how many will you hire? That's a function of what your benefit or MRP is, which is your demand for labor. Wherever your demand or MRP meets your marginal cost, this is the employment that will make your profits to maximize. Supply perfectly elastic means you're a wage taker, which means basically that you can hire 1 worker, 2 workers, 3 workers, whatever workers, you'll pay that wage rate. Okay? And MRP is like this because of the fact that MRP is MP times P. But what is important to understand is this, that before Q1, MRP is greater than marginal cost. After Q1, MRP is less than marginal cost. So whenever MRP is greater than marginal cost, which means extra revenue that you get from hiring a worker is more than the extra cost. And if extra revenue is more than the extra cost, this means extra profit will be positive. So your total profit will go up, you should hire more workers. Q1 is the quantity that you will hire. Why you will hire that? We'll be coming to this one. Similarly, MRP is less than MC. The extra benefit of hiring a worker is less than the cost of hiring the worker. Then the workers are basically adding to your losses because extra profit is negative. So you should hire less workers. But when MC is equal to MRP, this is where we believe that this is the profit maximizing level of employment. So when MRP equals to MC, this is what we call a profit maximizing level of employment. Are you all with me? At that point, what we believe is that your profits are maximized because this is the point where your employer or any employer who's hiring will be maximizing profits. Got it? So that's something which whenever you have a question about your perfect competition, you have to mention MRP theory. If you don't mention MRP theory, you will not get your marks. So mention the assumptions, but mention the MRP theory. Yes. The third diagram is basically with this wage rate is your demand for labor. Why is this my demand for labor? Because the guy is like, people are demanding my services. Worker would be like at the going wage rate, which is the demand for labor. I can work for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever hours, I get the wage rate WC. But how many hours will I work? I'm going to look at my supply curve. My supply curve is like this. It's upward sloping. Why? More the money, more the hours I will work. Isn't that true? Higher wages means my incentive to work will go up, I'm going to work more. Make sense? And that's why we will have a equilibrium here, like let's call this Q2. Okay, so both parties are wage takers in a perfectly competitive setting, and MC is equal to MRP matters for a firm, and that's where we decide how many workers to hire. But the wage comes from the market, which is where the demand and supply is. So that's the first case. We good to move on to the second case? In the second case, we are looking at what we call monopsony. Monopsony basically means you are the single buyer in the labor market. You're the only one, you're the only firm in the market. Everyone works for you. Let's say a town में एक school है, उस school का it's the only school in the whole market. You become the industry. The school is the industry. Every single teacher who wants to become a teacher would work for you. Okay, so if you want to attract them, to work for you, you may want to attract them from any other industry because you're the only firm in the industry. So you're a single buyer in the market, you are the only firm that is controlling the market. Anyone who wants to become a teacher has to work for that school. And let's say if there's a physics teacher needed, what I'll do is that I'm going to ask an engineer to come and work for me. If that engineer has to be attracted to my industry, I may need to pay him more than what he's getting as an engineer. If I want to get an economics teacher, basically, I may sort of ask somebody who's doing some economics work somewhere. I'm going to say, you know what, teach economics for me. I may need to pay him higher than what the market is paying for him as an economics sort of an analyst to teach economics for me. So in other words, you would attract from other industries people for your industry, because your industry, you're the only employer out there. And that's why what we believe is this, that in such a case, you have what we call an upward sloping supply of labor. What do we mean by this? Let's see this in terms of a diagram. And this is an important thing to understand. Single buyer is what? Which means there's only one firm. One, in a way, yes. How would you? An important point to understand is this, that is if this is my monopsony, then what I'm saying is this, that your supply curve is like this. Your supply curve is upward sloping. This upward sloping supply curve means basically that when you are looking at this diagram, let me just first write this, that when you want to basically hire an extra worker, you have to pay that extra worker a higher wage rate. This is what upper sloping would mean. In order to attract workers to work for your industry, you got to pay them more. Why does this matter when your supply curve is upward sloping? This is an important thing to understand, this, that if your supply curve is upward sloping, so let's say previously you were paying $10 and you had only 10 workers working for you. Okay, so now if you want the 11th guy to work for you, you got to pay them more. Let's say you pay them $12. If I ask you what's your total cost of hiring 10 workers, you'll be like, it's going to be $10 times 10, which is $100. But what's your total cost of hiring 11 workers? You'll be like, 11 is the wage rate, but 12 is the wage rate times 11, which means 12 times 11 is 132, which would mean my marginal cost of hiring one extra worker, cost of hiring one extra worker is actually 32. Why is the cost so high? आपने बंदा एक हायर किया लेकिन आपकी cost, marginal cost 32 हो गई. And the reason is simply that for the first 10 guys, you paid them $2 extra. And then this 11th guy that you hired, ये जो आपने एक बढ़ाया, you paid him $12. Which would mean $20 here plus $12 here, which would mean your total cost marginal cost became 32. Yes. So when you are hiring an extra worker, you not only pay that worker extra money, the $12, but you got to increase the wage rate of all other workers who were previously paid a lower salary. So all the workers were paid $10. Now all the 10 workers are now paid $2 extra. Why are you paying them $2 extra? Because you've hired another guy at 12. So all these 10 guys were paid $2 extra. That's why my total cost went up by 20 for the existing workers. And then this guy was paid $12. That's why my total marginal cost became 32. So when the supply curve is upward sloping, remember this, that my marginal cost will always be like this. Be above. I want to choose another color. Be like this, which is above the supply curve. Marginal cost is above the supply curve because in order to hire an extra worker, you are not only paying that worker more salary, but also you got to increase the salary of all other workers. Okay. So what is supply curve? Supply curve is your wage rate. If your wage rate goes to 12, your marginal cost will go to 32, for example. Make sense? Your wage rate goes to 12, your marginal cost will be 32. So, and when you hire an extra worker, you got to increase the wage rate of not only that worker, but for all other workers that are in the market. Got it? Remember this, that in this case, you are the only firm in the industry. How do we use this knowledge to find equilibrium? Can we move on to the equilibrium now? Now, for the equilibrium, the way we're going to move on is this. So, we're going to make our demand curve, we're going to make our same supply curve. Supply of labor is like this. My marginal cost is like this. And my MRP, again, I'm going to make MRP like this. Now, my MRP is my demand for labor. Quantity of labor is like this. Your wage rate is like this. MC is equal to MRP. Again, the profit maximization rule is MC is equal to MRP. We're going to follow that rule, and MC is equal to MRP happens here, and that's why this is the amount of sort of workers that the monopsony will hire. Yep. So supply curve is upward sloping. Marginal cost is above supply curve. MRP is like this. MC is equal to MRP is the profit maximizing rule. I'm going to have QM workers. But the trick here is this, that this is also my wage rate. Supply is my wage rate, right? How much wage rate will I pay? That will come from here. It won't come from it will not come from here, it will come from a supply of labor. And that is equal to this WM. Now, if this same market was under perfect competition, are we happy with the WM and QM? If the same market now was under perfect competition, we would have paid them where demand and supply was equal. Perfect competition pays them. Industry perfect competition pays when demand and supply is equal. Isn't that true? Because this is one industry versus another industry. Monopsony is an industry, right? So the monopsony would have paid you WM and QM, but perfect competition would have been paid you WC and QC. So what I'm saying here is that monopsony, by being powerful, not only does two things. Number one, it pays you less. Number two, it employs less. So a monopsony is, this is the question that comes, does monopsony exploit its workers? And the answer is yes, because monopsony pays less and employs yes, as compared to perfect competition, pays less and employs less workers as compared to perfectly competitive labor market. So that's why one would argue this, that a monopsony is exploitative by very nature of its power. It can actually pays you less and actually employs less workers. Okay, does that make sense? That's our second case. So now we will talk about the third case, case number 3, which is basically a bit complicated. The case number 3 is what we call the bilateral monopoly, which is basically your trade union versus monopsony. Okay, in this, your trade union is negotiating with the firm, which is the only employer in the market, right? So this is a bit complicated. So in this case, what we say is that if the trade union is negotiating with the firm, then the trade union has what we call if the trade union has a bargaining power, then it will be able to sort of determine the price. So, but before we talk about this, that in this case, what we say is that the trade union through bargaining power will try to negotiate higher wage rate, and we also believe that in this case the equilibrium will depend on bargaining power of the two parties. And lastly, we also will see this, that there will be no stable equilibrium. In other words, this equilibrium can change depending on changes in bargaining power, but it will not be always the same. It may change, it has a potential to change. Also, we will see that in this case, employment and wages both depend on bargaining power. So let's draw the case to see how it works. Are we going to move on? In this case, what we do first is this, that when we make a diagram, we will make a diagram in this manner. We will make a dotted sort of supply curve. And let's make also a dotted marginal cost curve. Okay, and I'll tell you why we're doing this, so that we can. So this is my wage rate and the quantity of labor. So if I draw my marginal revenue product, my MRP is like this, as usual. MRP is my demand right now. Now MC is equal to MRP is basically leading to, if MC is equal to MRP was happening here, then we know this, that Monopsony will be hiring these many workers for this wage rate WM, if the Monopsony was hiring. And perfect competition would be hiring at this point. Isn't that true? Now, let's say the trade union comes into play. Trade union says that, you know what, give us the wage equal to this competitive wage rate, or more. Okay, we will not work for any wage rate below this point X. So give us this wage rate or more, but not any wage rate below. And that's why this part of my supply curve is no longer valid. Why? Because since this wage rate does not exist, this supply curve would not matter. Are you all with me? Similarly, when this is your wage rate, your marginal cost would be what? When your supply curve is perfectly elastic, your marginal cost would be like this. Your marginal cost would be perfectly elastic as well. Why? Wage rate is perfectly elastic means you can hire as many workers, but the wage rate would be the same. But when your supply curve is upward sloping, your marginal cost would be, I'll draw a line all the way upward, your marginal cost would be this. In other words, your supply curve is WCXSL. Your marginal cost would be, let's call this Y. Exactly, WCX for the same part, and then Y MCL. So like this. Make sense? Now, because this part of my supply curve was gone, this part of my marginal cost is no longer valid as well. Correct? Are you all with me? जब आपने बोला कि this is not, there is, he's not working this supply curve is gone. Anything below WC, he's not going to work. Then for this supply curve, this is the marginal cost of that. Okay? So for this supply curve, this is my marginal cost. For this supply curve, this is also my marginal cost. Each worker is paid the same salary. Every single worker that you hire, or every single hour the same salary is paid, wage rate is the same as the marginal cost. Now, MC is equal to MRP, should be new MC is equal to MRP, which is happening at point X. So at point X, we are looking at the employment level to be here. So not only the wages are higher, but the quantity that you are hiring is also higher. So in a monopsony, what happens is this: we were getting paid less, but in a bilateral monopoly, if the wage rate is negotiated at the competitive level, then both wages and employment sort of rises or improves. Isn't that true? Your wages will become WC, your employment will become QC, so better wages and better employment. And that's why what we believe is this, that trade unions can actually end up improving the scenario for workers. Okay? Higher wages and higher employment level. If you ask for a wage rate higher than WC, then basically this is what your wage rate will become. Let's say something like this. If the trade union becomes too greedy, let's not draw this. I just want you to explain this point, that any wage rate above the WC actually does what? Now this is my new MC, and therefore MC is equal to MRP would happen here. इसका मतलब है आपका employment actually level आपका गिर जाएगा. Your employment level will fall. If you become too greedy and ask for a wage rate higher than the competitive level, you end up hurting your workers, because now employer will find it so expensive, he's going to start cutting down on the number of workers. So what we believe is this, that any wage rate below the competitive level is, any wage rate above the competitive level will only end up employment to get affected. You may get a higher salary at the expense of lower employment. So the best wage rate to ask for is the competitive wage rate, because above that you will not be able to get yourself the same employment level, or the highest employment level is happening at WC. Now why do we call it an unstable equilibrium? It's an unstable equilibrium. It actually came in one exam question that there is no stable equilibrium or unstable equilibrium, because it all depends on bargaining power. Bargaining power ज़्यादा होगी तो आप competitive wage rate मांगोगे. If it's low and if it's not there, your wage would be this one, WM. Make sense? If it's there, it is going to be higher. And if you really want to be getting the best wage rate, go for the competitive wage rate. So it's an unstable equilibrium, and it depends on bargaining power. Higher the bargaining power, higher the wage rate, and possibly higher the employment level. Okay? Now, the other question which came is that does imperfect competition lead to worker exploitation? And the answer is, in the first case we saw, yes, it was doing that. In this case, we will say that it depends on bargaining power. In the pure monopsony case, yes, it does result in lower wages and lower employment. But in this case, when you draw the whole case and you explain the idea, you say that it all depends on bargaining power. Because in this case, it may not lead to exploitation to happen. Correct? Is that fine? This brings us to the last sort of case here, which is so in this case, trade union in a perfectly competitive market. In this case, what we say is this, that let's say this is demand, wage and quantity of the perfectly competitive market. And the wage rate. And let's say the trade union now comes in the power, and trade union says this, that pay us a higher wage rate like WT. Now, in this case, the wage rate goes above the equilibrium. What's the harm of this? There will be this many workers wanting to work, but only these many workers able to get work. So Q2 minus Q1 would be my level of unemployment, and that's why unemployment would be Q2 minus Q1. But if you compare it from the scenario before, these many people who were previously employed will now lose job because the trade union has asked for higher wages than equilibrium. In other words, QC minus Q1 are the workers losing their jobs. Yeah, if your wage rate is, it's like any price above equilibrium will cause some kind of a shortage or a surplus. This time there is a surplus of workers because more workers wanting to work than the employer wanting to hire, and that's why Q2 minus Q1 is the level of unemployment. But पिछले case के मुकाबले में these were the people working, now only these one will be working. So these many people are losing their jobs. The level of employment has gone down from QC to Q1. Okay, is that fine? Are we good? There is an important last sort of discussion is this, when is, are we good to move on? Let's talk about that. When is, and this comes a lot in MCQs, when is trade union more powerful? Number one, when the demand for labor is inelastic. If the labor demand is inelastic, automatically the demand then automatically trade union will be more powerful. और trade union की labor की demand कब inelastic होती है? When the good that they make is also inelastic. If the good that they make is inelastic, then they automatically, like doctors' demand would be inelastic, so doctors' union will also have a very powerful negotiating power. Okay, number one. Number two is when there is full employment in the industry. अगर इंडस्ट्री में फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट होगी, then the employer will find it difficult to find replacement workers. So trade union will tend to be more powerful. But if you have a lot of people available easily, then trade union may not have that much power. The third case is also an important point, that when the employer is a monopoly. When the employer is a monopoly, we're saying that trade union will be more powerful. Why? Because if the market is very competitive, perfect competition hoga market mein, the problem that happens is this, that trade union may ask for a higher wage, but your profits will go down then, and you may go out of market. But when you are negotiating with a monopoly, you know monopoly has a lot of money. Monopoly can negotiate, you can negotiate and ask for a higher wage. But if you are in a very stiff competitive environment, one would argue this, that you won't be able to basically see the price to actually, you won't be able to see the monopoly, the perfect competition to change the price because of the rise in cost. So competitive markets mein trade unions are less powerful, and otherwise the trade unions are monopolies, partners in trade union are more powerful. Okay, so that's your story for the wage determination.